The sun had already dipped behind the soft, rolling hills of Tuscany when the first report came in. It was a quiet evening in Montecatini Terme, the kind of evening locals often celebrated with a slow stroll along tree-lined paths or a glass of red wine on their balconies. But on that particular day, May 15th, 2025, the peace was deceptive. Beneath the golden hue of the fading light, in the shadows of a nearly abandoned farmhouse tucked away off a winding rural road, a suitcase lay still. It was large, black, and unmarked, its presence ominous among the overgrown weeds and crumbling walls. The area had been left to rot over time, but that suitcase had not. It was new, intact. And when authorities arrived after a farmer's dog kept returning to sniff it, what they found inside shattered every sense of peace this postcard-perfect town had ever known. Inside the suitcase was the dismembered and decapitated body of Maria Denisa Paun, a 30-year-old Romanian national. Her head was missing, her limbs were carefully packed around her torso, and the entire scene reeked of deliberation, cruelty, and hatred. Who could do this? And why? That question would echo through Tuscany, then Italy, then all of Europe over the next few weeks as details of Maria's final days began to unfold. Layer by layer, horror by horror. Maria wasn't a name many in the quiet Italian town knew. She was not a local. In fact, she hadn't lived there for long. But those who had seen her described her as graceful, warm, and heartbreakingly beautiful. Born in Romania, Maria had moved to Italy searching for a better life. But that path, like many before hers, had been paved with false promises and bruised dreams. She began as a caregiver in northern Italy, moved through cleaning jobs, and by 2023 had found herself in the world of escort services. Whether by force, choice, or circumstance, Maria was living on the fringe of society, yet doing everything she could to survive. Her social media told one story: flawless makeup, soft filters, smiles. Reality told another, one of stress, unending bills, and increasing threats. She had been staying at Hotel Ferrucci in Prato, room 101, just outside Florence. Surveillance cameras captured her entering the hotel late on the evening of May 14th. She looked tired. Her phone was clutched in one hand, and a small overnight bag was slung over her shoulder. She never checked out. She never made another phone call. She never walked out that door again. The next day, staff knocked on her door and got no answer. By the evening of May 15th, when she hadn't responded to texts from her roommate or shown up for a scheduled appointment, her name was filed as missing. But the horror of what had happened was already set in motion. Her killer was not a stranger. He was not some monstrous figure hiding in the shadows. He was a man she knew, a man she had once trusted. Vasile Frumuzac, a 32-year-old Romanian security guard who worked odd shifts in nearby warehouses and lived in the same region. By all outward appearances, he was a normal man, married, a father, quiet. But behind closed doors, things were unraveling. Vasile and Maria had been involved for months. Their relationship, while never fully defined, was toxic from the start. Maria had reportedly threatened to expose their relationship to his wife and family unless he paid her 10,000 euros, money he didn't have. Text messages retrieved later would show the two arguing, with Maria growing more insistent and Vasile growing more desperate. What started as infatuation had turned into blackmail. What began as an affair ended in slaughter. On May 15th, after entering room 101, Vasile confronted Maria. Witnesses from the hallway later told police they'd heard loud voices, furniture being moved, something heavy hitting the floor. But in a hotel like Ferrucci, where guests came and went for all sorts of private reasons, the staff had learned not to pry. They didn't knock. They didn't intervene. And while Maria was being strangled, slowly, painfully, no one came to help. It took time for Vasile to decide what to do next. He didn't panic. He didn't call the police or turn himself in. Instead, he got to work. Over the next 12 hours, he stayed inside the hotel room, wrapping Maria's body in plastic, finding tools, and preparing a large suitcase he'd brought in earlier. At some point, he beheaded her. No one knows if it was out of rage or a calculated attempt to hinder identification. He packed her limbs around her torso, closed the suitcase, and wheeled it out the service entrance. Hotel cameras captured it all. His exit was slow, cautious. He avoided the front desk. He wore gloves. He loaded the suitcase into his car and drove it out toward Montecatini Terme, a town with few people and fewer questions. He parked near the derelict farmhouse and dragged the case into the overgrown weeds, hiding it behind what remained of a stone wall. Then he left. He drove home. He went to sleep beside his wife, and the next morning, he got up for work as if nothing had happened. For nearly 3 weeks, no one knew where Maria was. Her phone had gone dark. Her bank accounts showed no activity. Her friends feared the worst. The police followed leads, interviewed associates, checked surveillance footage, but her body remained unfound. And then the dog found the suitcase. Its barking brought the farmer, who called the police. And what emerged from that suitcase changed everything. It took forensic teams hours to confirm the body's identity. The head was never recovered. Vasile would later admit to burning it in a field to destroy evidence. But fingerprints and DNA told the rest of the story. It was Maria, and she had suffered. Her body showed signs of struggle, and the suitcase was meticulously packed. Clothes used to absorb blood, plastic wrap layered between limbs. It was not the work of someone who had acted in the heat of the moment. This was planned, methodical, cruel. Vasile was arrested 3 days later, confronted with CCTV footage, GPS tracking, and DNA evidence. He confessed. He claimed he had killed Maria because she was blackmailing him and threatening his family. He said he didn't mean to strangle her, but once she was dead, he had no choice. He showed no remorse, no tears, no sorrow. Italy erupted, not in riots, but in headlines, in debates, in fear. Feminist organizations called it another example of how women in vulnerable positions, immigrants, sex workers, outsiders, were the easiest targets. The Romanian community in Italy mourned in silence, too afraid to speak, too familiar with being ignored. Maria's name trended for a while on social media. Her face, flawless, filtered, was plastered on digital walls with the words, "Justice for Maria." But justice felt like a faint word compared to the horror of what had been done. As police reconstructed the case, they discovered just how many systems had failed Maria. She had reached out to friends weeks earlier, saying she was scared. She suspected she was being followed. She didn't trust the people around her. But no one knew how serious it was. No one thought her death would be so brutal, so complete. She was isolated, and no one came for her in time. After the arrest, Tuscany's idyllic charm began to wilt beneath the weight of what had been discovered. Journalists flooded the narrow streets of Montecatini Terme, where locals pointed silently toward the crumbling farmhouse, now cordoned off with red and white tape. The suitcase was gone, but the stain it left behind would not be washed away by the soft rains of early summer. In Prato, the Hotel Ferrucci became the symbol of silence and indifference. Room 101 was sealed, its door a grim reminder of a woman's final moments. And inside the police station, investigators were piecing together not just a murder, but a system that had allowed Maria Denisa Paun to disappear long before her body was found. In the days following Vasile Frumusace's confession, Italian media began dissecting Maria's life. Some called her a sex worker, others a young woman trapped in a life she never truly chose. As the story evolved, it became clear that Maria had existed in the shadows, where protection was scarce, rights were blurred, and violence often went unnoticed. She had lived under aliases, moved through cities, switched phones frequently. Friends she had met in escort circles said she was fiercely private, wary of men, and growing increasingly paranoid. She had spoken of threats, of money demands, of a man she once loved who had turned dark. She didn't say his name, but now they all knew who he was. Born in Romania's rural northeast, Maria came from a working-class family that, like many others, struggled to survive after the fall of communism. She was the second of 4 daughters, quiet, bookish, and always dreaming of Europe. Her teachers remembered her as smart but distracted, always staring out the window. By the age of 19, she had moved to Bucharest to work in a call center. It didn't last. Economic hardship pushed her to seek work abroad. Italy promised more than it could ever give. She arrived in Milan in 2017 and worked in domestic care, then waitressing, then cleaning. Her papers were irregular. Some weeks she earned enough to send money home. Other weeks she barely ate. Eventually, a roommate introduced her to a man who helped girls find rich clients. That's how it started. Maria didn't jump into the world of escorting. She slid into it, inch by inch, driven by debt and the unrelenting pressure to send euros back to her family. They never knew how she made her money. They thought she was a receptionist. By the time she met Vasile Frumuzac in late 2024, she had been operating independently for over a year. Her online ads were written in careful Italian, her photos tastefully blurred, her pricing consistent. She rented rooms in hotels, used encrypted messaging apps, and avoided pimps. She believed she was in control. But control in her line of work was always an illusion. Vasile was different from her clients. He was persistent, possessive, and charming in the way manipulators often are. He came to see her 3 times in 1 month, then 5. Then he asked for discounts. Then he began asking her to see only him. She refused. He offered to help her get a real job. She declined. He said he could protect her. She didn't believe him. But still, something about him lingered. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was hope. But their dynamic shifted from client service to something far more toxic, and Maria soon realized it was a mistake. By March 2025, she was trying to pull away. She told a friend he was watching her. She mentioned him showing up unannounced, threatening to tell her family everything, to send her photos to her sisters. She felt trapped. That's when the messages started. Dozens of texts from Maria to Vasile, asking for money, threatening to expose the affair. Whether it was truly blackmail or a desperate attempt to reclaim power, we may never know. But what's certain is that their relationship had turned deadly. Vasile, for his part, told police he had panicked, that he didn't mean to kill her, but his actions told a different story. He had come prepared, with gloves, plastic wrap, a large suitcase, and a change of clothes. He had parked in the hotel's blind spot. He had waited for the night shift when staffing was low. And after killing her, he didn't leave her behind. He spent hours desecrating her body, cutting it with care, ensuring there was no mess, no evidence, just a tidy package of flesh and silence. The autopsy was brutal to read. Strangulation, bruising, fractured ribs, cuts made post-mortem, absence of defensive wounds suggesting she was overpowered fast. Her head had been burned beyond recognition, left in a secluded field that Vasile led police to, only after intense questioning. Forensic teams recovered bone fragments and dental material, enough to confirm identity, but not enough to ease the horror. The trial date was set for late 2025. Until then, Vasile would remain in solitary confinement under suicide watch. His lawyers painted him as a man pushed beyond the edge, tormented by shame and manipulation. But the prosecution presented a different image, a predator who had lured a vulnerable woman into his grip, then killed her when she no longer fit the fantasy he'd created. The courtroom would soon become a battlefield, not just over guilt, but over narrative. Maria's family flew in from Romania in June. Her mother, Anna, wore black and carried a photo of Maria as a child, smiling, clutching a red umbrella in the rain. They hadn't known how she lived. They didn't understand what had happened until they saw the news. They sat in the front row of the courtroom, silent, dazed, broken. They didn't speak to the press. They didn't need to. Their grief spoke volumes. As coverage spread across Europe, Maria became a symbol, not just of violence, but of invisibility. The thousands of women who work in silence, who disappear between borders, who fall in love with the wrong man, or are pushed to desperate measures by poverty, these were the echoes in her story. Advocacy groups in Italy and Romania demanded better protections for sex workers, better cross-border communication, better shelters, more awareness. But progress was slow, as it always is. In a statement read during a candlelight vigil outside Florence, a friend of Maria's said, "She wasn't just what they say she was. She was kind. She bought gifts for her sisters. She wanted to go back home. She had dreams. She was more than a suitcase." The crowd didn't cheer. They stood in silence. Some cried. Others lit candles and placed white lilies near the fountain. Her name flickered in the flame. And in that moment, she was no longer a victim. She was someone they knew, someone they failed. In the weeks leading up to Vasile Frumuzace's trial, the mood across Tuscany turned from horror to reckoning. People who had once passed each other on the street without a glance now found themselves exchanging uneasy nods, as if acknowledging a shared shadow they could no longer ignore. The countryside, which once seemed like a paradise tucked away from the dangers of the world, now whispered a different truth. Evil hadn't arrived from outside. It had lived among them, moved quietly, worked at a security post, loved a woman he would later dismember, and the more details emerged, the harder it became to look away. The prosecution's case was built on chilling precision. They had Vasile's phone records, tracking his movements from his home to the hotel, and then out to the abandoned farmhouse. They had CCTV footage of him wheeling the suitcase out the back of Hotel Ferrucci, carefully avoiding eye contact, his face shielded by a baseball cap. They had evidence from the room, fibers, blood traces, fingerprints, all pointing to a scene of meticulous post-murder staging. But most damning of all, they had his own words. In a police confession videotaped just days after his arrest, Vasile recounted everything with a calm that disturbed even seasoned detectives. He explained how he waited for the night shift, brought tools in his car, entered the room and started arguing with Maria. When she told him she would send photos to his wife unless he gave her the 10,000 euros she demanded, something snapped. "I told her she wouldn't ruin my life," he said almost softly. "I didn't plan to kill her, but she kept pushing." He described grabbing her by the neck, squeezing until she stopped moving, and sitting on the bed for nearly an hour, staring at her body, deciding what to do next. He chose dismemberment. "I thought if I could hide her well enough, they'd think she left," he said. "I just needed time." What he didn't realize was that time was never on his side. Every action he took left a trail, from his phone's GPS pinging near the field where he burned Maria's head, to the fuel purchase receipt time-stamped just minutes after the act, to the texts he'd sent her just days before filled with veiled threats. Each piece formed a mosaic of murder. His defense argued diminished responsibility, that he had been under immense psychological stress, that he was being manipulated, blackmailed, emotionally cornered. They presented his clean criminal record, his role as a father, the testimonies of co-workers who described him as quiet and polite, but the courtroom stuffed with reporters, activists, and Maria's grieving family listened in near silence, because nothing they could say would wash the blood off his hands. Not now, not ever. Maria's family testified on the third day. Her mother, Anna, sobbed through most of her time on the stand, clutching a rosary and a laminated photo of Maria from her high school graduation. "She was my little girl," she whispered through a translator. "She didn't deserve to die like this. No one does." Her father, a gaunt man with shaking hands, could barely look at Vasile. He spoke only once, saying, "We didn't even get to bury her whole." That line, simple, devastating, hung in the courtroom air like a ghost. Then came the medical examiner. His testimony was graphic, clinical, and haunting. He described the compression injuries around Maria's neck, consistent with manual strangulation. He noted the methodical nature of the cuts, suggesting they were made with care and intent, not in a frenzy. The absence of defensive wounds meant she had likely been taken by surprise or overpowered immediately. He added that the head, when later found, had been so badly burned it was nearly reduced to ash. Only dental records confirmed the identity. It was not a quick death, he concluded. It was not merciful. Public opinion, which had initially been divided, some questioning Maria's lifestyle, others blaming both parties, now turned entirely against Vasile. The narrative had shifted. This was no crime of passion, it was annihilation. Maria's work, her background, her supposed blackmail, all became irrelevant in the face of the sheer brutality inflicted upon her. She could have been anyone, a daughter, a sister, a friend. She had trusted a man, and he had turned her into nothing more than remains in a suitcase. When the verdict came, there was no gasp, no cheer, only silence. Guilty on all counts: murder, destruction of a corpse, premeditation. The judge, in his closing remarks, called the crime an act of profound evil, noting that the level of cruelty shown by the defendant left no room for mitigation. Vasile Frumuzace was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He did not react. He did not cry. He stood still, as if already resigned to the weight of the bars he would now call home. Outside the courtroom, Maria's mother collapsed into her husband's arms. Journalists respectfully gave them space. A small group of women, activists, survivors, advocates, held up placards that read, "She wasn't just a body." For them, justice wasn't just a verdict. It was a call to keep fighting. Because Maria wasn't the first and she wouldn't be the last. The case triggered widespread debate across Italy. Politicians took to parliament, some calling for tougher laws against femicide, others blaming migration, morality, and the decline of traditional values. But at the heart of it all was Maria, a woman who wanted to survive, who tried to love, who was punished for trying to reclaim power. Her name was invoked in protests, in vigils, in speeches made in both Italy and Romania. Her face became a symbol, not of shame, but of resistance. In the end, justice came, but not peace, because peace would have meant Maria never had to fear for her life. It would have meant someone believed her when she said she was in danger. It would have meant society saw her not as a problem to be ignored, but as a life to be protected. And that didn't happen. Not soon enough. Months passed, and yet the memory of Maria Denisa Paun refused to fade. Tuscany moved on in appearance. The sun still bathed its hills in golden warmth. Tourists still wandered through cobbled streets with gelato in hand, and hotel rooms were still booked under false names. But beneath the surface, a quiet unease lingered, one born of guilt and realization. The case had not only shaken the town, it had forced Italy to confront a truth it had long ignored, that women living on the margins, especially migrant women, were dangerously invisible. Maria's story, preserved in trial transcripts and news reports, had transformed her from a private, hidden woman into a public mirror, reflecting the failures of multiple systems. In Prato, the staff of Hotel Ferrucci struggled with their own quiet torment. No one had knocked on her door that night. No one had reported the raised voices or the dull thud of a body hitting the floor. And though the hotel couldn't have known the full truth, they knew something had been wrong. They always did. Hotel workers in places like this aren't blind. They see the signs, the frightened eyes, the rushed exits, the bruises half hidden under makeup. But when survival depends on silence, on turning away, on pretending that women like Maria are just passing through, complicity becomes a form of routine. The receptionist who handed over the key to room 101 left his job 2 weeks after the body was found. He didn't leave a note. In Romania, Maria's village began to speak of her differently. At first there was shame, whispers that she had gone abroad to sin, that she had brought dishonor to her family. But over time, that faded too. A local teacher who had once taught Maria in primary school gave an interview in which she said, "She was a smart girl, a bright girl. We all let her down." That single sentence reverberated through Romanian social media, where activists picked up Maria's name and folded her into broader campaigns about trafficking, migration, and the dangers women face when trying to build a life across borders. Maria's sisters were quieter. They rarely spoke to journalists. But one, the second oldest, released a short statement a month after the trial concluded. It read, "My sister wasn't perfect, but she was real. She was alive. She laughed, she fought, she cried, and she wanted more from this world. Now we bury what's left of her and try to live with the pieces." Burial was complicated, with her body decapitated and her head partially cremated in a field. There was no traditional funeral. A Romanian Orthodox priest agreed to bless the remains, and her coffin was closed. No one was allowed to open it. Her mother stood by it for hours, pressing her forehead against the polished wood as if willing the truth to disappear. But the truth stayed. The images stayed. The brutality stayed. Back in Italy, the case had ignited something stronger than conversation. In Florence, a coalition of women's rights organizations launched a joint initiative called My Pew, or Never Again. The campaign focused on legal reform, calling for mandatory background checks for hotel guests, harsher penalties for gender-based violence, and protection laws specifically aimed at undocumented migrant workers and sex workers. Their manifesto began with Maria's name. Not her profession, not her nationality, just her name, as if that alone were enough to say she mattered. In Parliament, debates grew fierce. Conservative voices tried to steer the conversation toward immigration, blaming the presence of foreign women in dangerous trades for the rise in femicides. But others pushed back, hard. She wasn't killed because she was foreign, one senator said. She was killed because she was a woman who said no, because she tried to leave, because our country still lets men get away with thinking they own the bodies of women they touch. That speech went viral, and Maria's face appeared once more on screens across the continent. Journalists from all over Europe began connecting her case to others. In France, a Moroccan sex worker had been beaten to death just weeks before Maria's murder. In Spain, an undocumented Ukrainian woman was pushed off a balcony by a client and ruled a suicide. In Greece, a trafficked Nigerian teenager was found drowned after escaping her captors. And in each case, there was no memorial, no trial, no justice. Maria's suitcase had become a coffin, not just for her, but for every woman who disappears without a name, without a face, without a fight. Maria's story had one more chapter. 6 months after Vasilei's conviction, his wife filed for divorce and left the region with their 2 children. She had not spoken publicly during the trial, but her departure was a statement in itself. She had lived with the man who killed another woman, lied to her every day and went to work after packing a corpse. She never returned to the courtroom, never spoke to the press, but people in her neighborhood said she cried often, that she sat on the edge of her bed at night, staring at the spot where her husband used to place his boots. Vasilei himself, now prisoner 48,391 in a maximum security facility near Milan, remained mostly silent. He filed no appeals. He gave no interviews. The last anyone heard from him was during sentencing when he said, "I just wanted it to end." Whether he meant the relationship, the blackmail, or Maria's life itself, no one knows. Perhaps even he didn't know. But what's certain is that his silence came too late. Writers, too, were drawn to Maria's story. A best-selling crime novelist began drafting a fictionalized account. A documentary crew from Belgium started filming interviews with Maria's friends, co-workers, and neighbors. A photojournalist followed her trail from Romania to Italy, capturing the faded bus stops and crumbling apartment blocks she had once passed. Everyone wanted to understand. Everyone wanted to find a reason, but the truth, once fully exposed, resisted simplicity. There was no single answer, no satisfying conclusion. Maria wasn't murdered because she was a saint or a sinner, not because she was poor or foreign, not because she was blackmailing anyone or seeking revenge. She was murdered because she dared to take control of her story, because she made a man feel powerless, because she tried to walk away. And in a world where male ego is often protected more fiercely than female lives, that decision cost her everything. The suitcase in which she was found was kept in evidence storage for nearly 5 months. Its contents were cataloged, photographed, logged into a government database. But when the trial concluded and all appeals were waived, it was destroyed, burned in a sealed furnace along with the clothing Maria had last worn. Her final enclosure, cleaned out, reduced to ash. But Maria could not be reduced. Not really. Her face, once lost among thousands, now hovered in courtrooms, in conversations, in classrooms where young girls spoke her name. She became a lesson, a warning, a martyr. But more importantly, she became a symbol of all the voices that whisper behind closed doors, that scream into pillows, that vanish into night with no one to hear them. A symbol that refused to stay zipped inside a suitcase. Even as time pressed forward, Maria Denisa Paun's story continued to haunt those who had come to know it. It wasn't just the brutality of her death, it was the unbearable clarity with which it exposed the places where our world still allows certain lives to be silenced, certain bodies to be erased. Her memory wasn't fading, it was fermenting, growing sharper, more painful, more urgent. And across Italy and beyond, it stirred people in ways few cases ever could. 6 months after the trial, a university in Florence hosted a panel discussion titled "The Price of Silence: Violence Against Migrant Women in Europe." The room was packed, not just with academics and journalists, but with survivors, students, and social workers. And at the center of every speech, every question, every statistic was Maria. One speaker, a Romanian activist who worked with trafficked women, held up a printed photo of her as a teenager. "She was one of us," she said, "and if we don't learn from this, truly learn, she won't be the last." That warning rang through the hearts of those who listened. In every major European city, networks of undocumented women and sex workers whispered Maria's name as a caution, a symbol of how quickly trust can become a death sentence. WhatsApp groups that shared safety tips now opened with a pinned post. "Remember Maria?" Her story became not just history but survival training. Meanwhile, in her village in Romania, a small library added a shelf in her name. "For girls with dreams," the plaque read. Children who once only knew Maria as someone who had gone abroad now read about her in local papers and heard her name in church prayers. Her mother still couldn't speak about her without breaking down. Her father stopped attending community gatherings, but her sisters began to live more boldly. One enrolled in nursing school. Another joined a feminist NGO that had reached out after the trial. They said Maria had left them strength in the most painful way possible. She had turned her end into their beginning. And while Maria's family rebuilt in pieces, her killer wasted away in silence. Vasile Frumuzacho, once a man with a wife, 2 children, a job, and a secret, now spent his days in a prison library, alone. The guards said he rarely spoke. He refused interviews. He declined visits from former friends. He became a ghost, alive but nowhere. Rumors spread that he had tried to harm himself. Others said he spent hours rereading court transcripts, as if trying to convince himself it had been someone else who strangled a woman to death, cut her into parts, burned her face away. But there was no forgetting, not for him, not for anyone. As the anniversary of Maria's death approached, Florence prepared for a memorial. Organized by a coalition of survivors, human rights activists, and volunteers, the event drew hundreds. They lit candles near the Arno River and read poems written in both Italian and Romanian. They held up signs with her name, not paired with her profession or the horror of her death, but just as a person, a human being. One woman read aloud from Maria's old social media posts, the ones that had once been buried under filters and emojis. "This one," she said, holding her phone, "was from her last birthday. All I want is peace and to feel safe again." That line broke something in the crowd. Tears followed, strangers embraced, and somewhere in that soft, aching moment, Maria was no longer just a case file or a cautionary tale. She was real again, alive in memory, alive in action. The organizers of the vigil announced a new scholarship in her name, the Maria Paun Fund for Vulnerable Women. It would provide housing support, legal aid, and mental health services for migrant women in Italy who found themselves trapped in abusive or precarious situations. The first recipient, a 27-year-old woman from Albania who had escaped a violent pimp, stood at the microphone and said, "Because Maria died, I got a second chance. I promised not to waste it." That promise traveled far beyond that night. It echoed in policy meetings in Brussels, where legislators debated pan-European protective measures for sex workers and undocumented laborers. It echoed in shelters across Italy, where women whispered to each other that someone had finally noticed. And it echoed in the hearts of those who had grown numb to headlines about missing women, because this time, one of those women had a name they could not forget. Maria's story also found its way into art. A Romanian filmmaker announced a documentary project. A sculptor in Naples created an installation titled La Valigia, the Suitcase, built entirely from broken mirrors. At the center stood a bronze figure of a woman, head bowed, surrounded by shards etched with words in multiple languages. "You see me now." The piece was unveiled in a small gallery with a plaque that read simply, "For Maria and all the ones still lost." Even the law began to shift, slowly, carefully, but undeniably. A regional law in Tuscany was passed requiring hotels to keep detailed guest records and to offer training to staff on identifying signs of trafficking and abuse. The law was named Legge Paun, the Pawn Law. It was a small step, but a real one. Maria had become legislation. Her death had forced action. Still, the ache lingered. There was no happy ending to be found. Not in a courtroom, not in a vigil, not in a law passed too late. Maria's story had ended in a suitcase, Her final breath had been stolen by a man who once whispered promises into her ear, and no amount of justice could return what had been taken. But what could grow in its place? Awareness, action, rage, resilience had begun to take root. That was something. At her gravesite, a visitor left a letter. It was anonymous. Just a folded piece of paper, pressed between fresh lilies and a candle, written in looping cursive. The cemetery groundskeeper found it days later. It read, "Dear Maria, I never knew you, but I will never forget you. You remind me of someone I love. You remind me of what's wrong with this world, but you also remind me why we fight to make it right. I hope you are at peace now. I'm sorry we weren't there when you needed us. I promise next time we will be." That promise, scribbled in ink and sorrow, may not be enough, but it's something. And sometimes in a world that so easily forgets the forgotten, even something can be sacred. Not long after the anniversary of her death, Maria Denisa Paun's name once again found itself whispered into new corners of the world, not through headlines this time, nor courtroom documents, but in quiet human spaces, in classrooms where professors spoke of gender-based violence, in shelters where women huddled over hot tea and shared fragments of their pain, in social media posts that began with hashtags but ended in confessions of fear and survival. She had become something much larger than anyone's story. She had become a ripple, and her ripple had turned into a wave. In Bucharest, a group of university students staged a small theater production titled Room 101. It was raw, minimal, and performed in near silence, relying on movement and light rather than dialogue. In the final scene, a woman alone in a room slowly begins to pack a suitcase, not with clothes, but with memories. Each memory is spoken aloud by other cast members as echoes, surrounding her like ghosts. The suitcase never closes. At the end, the woman walks away, leaving it open for the audience to stare into. When asked what the piece meant, the director said, "It's about what happens when no one listens, when the warning signs are packed away, when we don't check what's inside until it's too late." That silence, the world's silence, had become the most suffocating part of Maria's legacy. Vasile may have committed the murder, but society had made it easy. Easy to ignore her, easy to dismiss her fear, easy to pretend she wasn't worthy of saving. And the reality was, for every Maria whose name made the news, there were dozens, hundreds of others whose stories never reached daylight. One of the most impactful developments came quietly, behind closed doors. At a secure location in northern Italy, a support group met twice a week for migrant women involved in sex work, many of them undocumented. After Maria's case, more women came forward, not to the police, not always to press charges, but to speak, to name what had happened to them. They talked of clients who turned violent, of men who promised love and delivered fear, of nights where the hotel walls felt too thin and the front desk too far away. And for the first time, they spoke Maria's name aloud, not as a warning, as a sister. "She was one of us," one woman said in Romanian. "She was brave." That word echoed around the circle. Brave, not foolish, not dirty, not disposable. Brave. The center's coordinator later said that Maria had done something she could never measure with statistics. Her death gave them a reason to survive. Sometimes that's more powerful than anything else. The media, though less frenzied now, still checked in. Updates were published about changes in local law enforcement protocols, about government grants issued to support at-risk women, about the efforts of Maria's family to bring her story into classrooms and community halls. A documentary titled Inside the Suitcase was released online, combining real interviews, reenactments, and Maria's own digital footprints. Her posts, her texts, her voice messages. It went viral within days, translated into 6 languages. In one haunting scene, the actress portraying Maria looks straight into the camera and says, "You see me now, don't you?" Her story reached survivors in South America, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe, regions where women face similar violence under the cover of invisibility. Letters poured into the documentary's production office. One from Poland read, "Because of Maria, I left the man who said he'd kill me if I ever told." Another from Brazil said simply, "She gave me the strength to run." But not all reactions were redemptive. There were those who continued to focus on Maria's profession, her choices, her flaws. Online forums teemed with cruel judgments, calling her greedy, immoral, or worse. Anonymous voices, always louder from behind screens, insisted she had brought this on herself. That darkness never really disappears. It only retreats when challenged. And it was challenged fiercely by thousands who saw in Maria something the world often fails to recognize in women like her: humanity. One of the final chapters in this journey came when Maria's hometown dedicated a mural in her memory. Painted on the side of an old community center, it showed a woman walking out of a suitcase, her hair blowing in the wind, one hand holding a burning match. Around her, words spiraled out in multiple languages. "I was here. I am still here." The unveiling drew dozens of people, some who had known Maria, others who had only read about her, all of them moved by what her life had become in death. Maria's mother, though too fragile to speak, stood before the mural with her hand on her heart. Her eyes were closed, as if listening to something only she could hear. A prayer, maybe, or perhaps the sound of her daughter's footsteps echoing down the hallway of memory. As the second year since her murder approached, a nonprofit organization launched the Suitcase Project, dedicated to tracking and memorializing women lost to violence across Europe. Each case was assigned a digital suitcase, a virtual space filled with photos, voice recordings, personal histories. Maria's was the first. Inside her suitcase were images of her as a child, her favorite song, the last message she sent to a friend, and the haunting final post she made before vanishing. "All I want is peace," she had written, "and to feel safe again." In the end, Maria's suitcase did not carry away her body. It carried her story. And from that story came movement, memory, meaning. No one could undo what had been done to her. No justice could ever make the act less brutal. No verdict could stitch her limbs back together. No sentence could restore the breath that had been choked from her lungs. But what could be done, what had been done, was to make her more than a headline, to make her impossible to forget. She had been silenced, but now she spoke through the laws that bore her name, the women who told their own stories because of her, the murals and films and scholarships that bloomed where her body had once been thrown away. Maria Denisa Paun was murdered by a man who thought she would vanish without a trace. Instead, she became a revolution. In the third year since Maria Denisa Paun was killed, her legacy deepened, not just in policy and protest, but in the quiet, unshakable way her name became a language of its own among women who knew danger, fear, and survival intimately. Her story didn't die in that hotel room. It wasn't buried in that decapitated body, nor sealed inside the suitcase that was meant to erase her. It had taken root, it had grown, and now it was blooming in the most unexpected places, in whispers and reforms, in hands held tighter than before. The Suitcase Project had gone global. What started as a digital memorial initiative became a living archive, an ever-growing map of lost women, each represented by a virtual suitcase filled with fragments of their stories. Users from over 60 countries submitted names. Sisters, mothers, former friends, even caseworkers. Each contributed photos, memories, testimonies, and timelines. These were not just tragic women. They were missing ones, forgotten ones, erased ones. And Maria's suitcase remained the most visited of them all. Her story became the threshold. Everyone who opened the site saw her first, the woman who refused to vanish. It inspired a wave of similar memorials, community art projects, school-led campaigns, and survivor-led public storytelling nights. In Vienna, a bus stop was transformed into an interactive exhibit where passengers could listen to the last words of victims of femicide. In Berlin, subway stations bore posters of women who had been lost to domestic violence, including Maria. And in Paris, a legal clinic opened under her name, offering pro bono representation to migrant women threatened by their partners or clients. Her name was no longer a headline, it was infrastructure. In Italy, the leg pound laws expanded. The original regional laws passed in Tuscany had proven effective. More hotel staff were trained to identify signs of abuse, and there was a measurable increase in reports of potential trafficking victims receiving timely intervention. Encouraged by this, national lawmakers passed additional legislation. The updated version mandated all hospitality businesses nationwide to install panic systems in rooms used for short-term bookings, especially in known red light zones. A hotline was created, multilingual support teams were formed, and in a rare gesture of cross-party agreement, it was named Maria's Protocol. This wasn't politics anymore. This was a reckoning. But still, Maria's family moved through life like a house cracked by lightning, still standing, but never whole. Her sisters moved to Bucharest, then eventually one of them to Belgium, working with an NGO. Her mother stayed behind in the village. She kept a photo of Maria by the window where the sun hit it each morning, warming her face. Sometimes she'd speak to it. Other times she'd just sit there silent, watching the wind outside as if waiting for her daughter to walk up the path one last time. She never did. Her grave became a place of pilgrimage, not on a grand scale. There were no crowds, no cameras. But every few weeks someone would come, alone, sometimes in pairs. They'd bring flowers or small notes or folded newspaper clippings. A few simply knelt and cried. Her name, etched in smooth stone, became something sacred. Maria Denisa Paun, 1994 to 2025. I am still here, and she was, in ways her killer could never have imagined. Inside prison, Vasile Frumusace remained withdrawn. He refused therapy. He refused interviews. A psychologist assigned to him wrote in a report that he displayed extreme emotional dissociation and presented as a man more haunted by consequences than guilt. There were no letters, no visitors. He existed now as a shadow, alive technically, but invisible, just as he had once tried to make Maria. In contrast, Maria's story began being taught in classrooms. In high schools and universities across Europe, she was studied alongside other cases that shaped modern law and awareness. Students debated the balance between privacy and protection, the ethics of surveillance, and the role of culture in normalizing gendered violence. In one sociology class in Naples, a student who had lost her aunt to domestic violence said, "When I read Maria's story, I felt like someone had finally said the thing we're all afraid to say, that silence is complicity, that pretending not to hear is how women die." That same realization began trickling into communities far beyond Italy. In the Philippines, an advocacy group adopted Maria's name for their Safe Exit campaign, helping trafficked women return home. In Nigeria, her story was printed in a women's justice newsletter distributed in shelters. In Colombia, graffiti artists painted her face beside the phrase, "Nunca más en una maleta," never again in a suitcase. The weight of her death was not just personal, it was global. Writers continued to explore her story. A best-selling nonfiction book titled Suitcase, The Murder of Maria Paun and the War Against Women's Silence, became an international bestseller. It traced not only her life and death, but also the cultural systems that had enabled it. The book ended with an imagined letter from Maria to the world. Though fictionalized, it was built on real messages, known thoughts, and careful empathy. It read, "I didn't ask to be your symbol. I only asked to be safe. But now that you're listening, don't stop. There are more like me, in hotel rooms, on buses, in your neighborhood. Don't look away. You didn't look away from me. Not in the end. So don't start now." That passage was quoted in speeches, printed on protest banners, tattooed on someone's arm in Palermo. And still, there was no ending. Because Maria's case wasn't about closure. It was about memory. It was about responsibility. It was about the world finally facing the mirror and asking itself what it values and who it protects. Every reform that followed, every woman who walked out of a dangerous room because she now knew her story mattered, was a page Maria had authored with her death. She was not buried quietly. She was not erased. Her suitcase did not stay shut. It was opened, and inside it, the world saw not just blood and bone, but truth. That truth will never be zipped away again. In the quiet space where grief and justice overlap, Maria Denisa Paun remained, not as a lingering ghost, nor as a symbol too heavy to bear, but as something strangely enduring. She was not gone in the way victims are often gone. She was spoken of, written into law, painted into murals, whispered through hotline conversations between terrified women and the strangers who answered in the night. Her life, once unseen, had become impossible to ignore. Her death, unspeakable in its cruelty, now spoke louder than the man who took it from her. By the fourth year after the murder, change had crept into places where silence had once ruled. Survivors who had remained in the shadows began emerging into the light. Some told their stories aloud for the first time, citing Maria's courage as their turning point. Others left behind notes in crisis centers or women's shelters, unsigned, anonymous, but achingly clear. Because she mattered, now I do too. In a remote part of Sicily, a former brothel turned women's safe house displayed Maria's portrait above the doorway. Below it was inscribed, La sua voce ci ha salvate. Her voice saved us. That house, funded in part by donations collected in Maria's name, became home to dozens of women escaping abusive men, many undocumented, many once invisible, like Maria. And inside those walls, her story was told again and again, not as horror, but as reminder, as warning, as fire. Back in Tuscany, the farmhouse where Vasile had taken Maria's dismembered body remained abandoned. Grass grew through the cracks in its foundation. The locals, once too horrified to speak of it, began treating it like a ruin from a darker time. Occasionally, someone would leave a flower at the gate. No signs, no words, just lilies or sometimes roses placed in silence, like a prayer no one dared to speak aloud. And still, the work continued. A coalition of Italian and Romanian lawmakers pushed for the creation of a Europe-wide database for vulnerable women, particularly those working without legal protections. The idea sparked fierce debate. Critics argued privacy risks. Advocates insisted lives were at stake. But through it all, Maria's name kept coming up. She had fallen between borders, identity, systems. Had she been flagged earlier? Had anyone known the risk she faced? Perhaps she would have survived. Perhaps someone would have intervened in time. The database was eventually approved. It was called Maria. Monitoring at-risk individuals across Europe. It wasn't enough. Nothing ever could be. But it was something. And that something kept multiplying. In Rome, a youth group launched an initiative that placed emergency contact cards in hotel rooms across the city, wallet-sized, discreet, printed in over 20 languages. On the back was a single sentence in bold red: "If you feel unsafe, you are not alone." At the bottom, a helpline. The card was unofficially referred to by staff and activists as the Maria card. It saved lives, not in grand cinematic ways, but in small, unseen moments. A text sent, a door answered, a life spared. One woman found crying outside a train station later told her caseworker, "I remembered the girl in the suitcase. I thought, I don't want to be found like that." She was taken in that night, given warmth, given a second chance. As for Maria's family, healing was slow, fragmented, incomplete. Her mother still wore black every day. Her father rarely left the house. But her youngest sister, now 20, became a public speaker. She traveled to schools and conferences across Europe, telling the story not of Maria's death, but of her life. She spoke of the girl who sang in the kitchen, who sent money home every month, who bought a red scarf for her sister and a second-hand doll for a cousin. She said, "They tell me Maria is a symbol now, but to me, she was my best friend." In one emotional talk, she held up a pair of her sister's shoes, the only thing recovered intact from the suitcase, and said, "She walked so far to be free. These are the shoes she died in, but I promise, they will not be the shoes she is remembered by." The audience stood in silence. Then applause broke. A full minute. Nothing needed to be said. Meanwhile, Vasile remained locked away, a figure reduced to shadows. He filed no appeals. He responded to no correspondence. The prison warden noted he had developed a tremor in his hands and often sat for hours staring at the floor. Once, during a psychological review, he was asked if he had anything to say about Maria. He said only, "She shouldn't have threatened me." The psychologist wrote, "No remorse detected." He was a man who had tried to erase a woman. In doing so, he had erased himself. And as more years passed, Maria's influence continued to bloom in places far beyond where her feet ever walked. A novel based loosely on her life was translated into 13 languages. A sculpture garden in Belgium included a new piece titled Denisa, a broken suitcase spilling flowers into the sky. In Oslo, survivors lit 121 candles, one for each woman killed by a partner or client in the EU that year. The last candle, larger than the rest, was for Maria. A placard nearby read, "She is not forgotten. She is the reason we are watching now." The irony of her death, that she had been silenced and discarded, was that it created one of the loudest, most enduring echoes Europe had ever heard. And that echo became action. It became a movement of women walking out of abusive rooms with their heads up. It became legislation with her name stamped in bold across the top. It became memorials that outlived headlines. It became daughters born into safer cities. It became candles that burned in places she had never seen, lit by people who whispered her name like a vow. Maria Denisa Paun, the girl in the suitcase, the name that refused to be zipped away. And in the end, that was her power. That was her revenge. That was her resurrection. Year 5 arrived not with silence, but with the unmistakable sound of persistence. The name Maria Denisa Paun was no longer relegated to footnotes or the fading memory of a singular crime. It had become a constant pulse in the heart of a growing global resistance. Across borders and languages, across class lines and cultures, she had taken root in the minds of the unheard, the unsafe, the unseen. Her story had defied death. It had turned grief into momentum. And that momentum no longer needed reminders to move forward. It had become instinct. In Florence, where it all began, a permanent memorial was unveiled in a public square not far from the Arno River. It wasn't grand or towering. It wasn't dramatic. It was something far more intimate, a life-sized bronze sculpture of a suitcase left half open, with a woman's hand reaching out, not in desperation, but in defiance. Her fingers, carved in fine detail, held a small piece of paper, forever frozen in the act of letting it go. On the paper in both Romanian and Italian was written, "I lived, I mattered." That single sentence broke something open in the people who gathered that day. Survivors stood hand in hand, weeping quietly. Mothers pulled their daughters close. A priest, a rabbi, and a humanist activist took turns reading short prayers and poems in different languages. And then, a moment of silence, followed not by applause but by a ripple of voices speaking her name. One by one, softly but deliberately, Maria, Maria, Maria. And still the world turned. The crimes continued, but so did the resistance. In Brussels, the Maria database expanded to include cross-border emergency alert systems that allowed authorities in different nations to flag dangerous individuals known to target migrant or undocumented women. In the first 3 months of its activation, over 40 women were redirected to safe houses in time. The database's success was presented before the European Parliament, with one Romanian delegate simply stating, "She saved them, even from the grave." The ripple reached beyond Europe. In New Delhi, a documentary about Maria won a Human Rights Film Award, leading to a renewed local conversation about femicide and systemic failure. In Johannesburg, activists organized a march with the slogan, "We carry their names, not their shame," a phrase taken from a Romanian essay written about Maria. In New York, a nonprofit focused on domestic violence held a vigil where her story was read aloud in full. The speaker, a survivor herself, closed her eyes and whispered, "I was almost Maria." Back in Romania, Maria's youngest sister published a book. Part memoir, part manifesto, it was titled The Girl in the Suitcase: How My Sister Changed the World. It became an instant bestseller, especially among young women. In schools, it was assigned reading. In therapy groups, it was passed hand to hand. And in shelters, it was hugged close, as if the pages themselves could offer warmth. The book's final chapter was a letter, a real one, written by Maria a year before her death. Never sent, but found in a draft folder on her phone. It read, "If I ever disappear, don't let them lie about me. Tell the truth, even if it's hard, even if it's ugly. I was a fighter. I had dreams. I messed up sometimes, but I never gave up. Don't let them say I was weak. I'm not. I won't be." That message became the heart of a new curriculum launched in several Eastern European schools focused on gender education, emotional literacy, and the rights of women. The program was named Never Weak. Meanwhile, the man who murdered her was still alive, still imprisoned. But he no longer existed in the public eye. His name had faded. His photograph disappeared from archives and articles. No interviews, no confessions. Just a cell and the knowledge that the woman he killed had changed more lives than he ever could comprehend. He had tried to reduce her to silence, to dismemberment, to a grim headline buried in the back of a newspaper. In a final poetic turn, a piece of legislation was introduced jointly by Romania and Italy that would allow women with residency complications tied to abusive relationships to seek immediate protected status. It passed with majority support. It was called Maria's Law. And when it passed, a group of lawmakers stood on the parliamentary steps and held a single white suitcase between them. Empty, because the woman who once filled it no longer lived there. She had outgrown it. She had risen from it. And the world had finally understood what was always true, that no one, no woman, no girl belongs in a suitcase. In the 6 years since Maria Denisa Paun's death, her name had stopped being uttered only in grief. It was now spoken in reverence, in activism, in hope. The story that once began with a brutal silence in a hotel room had erupted into a thunderous, unrelenting movement, touching thousands, perhaps millions. Her life, once reduced to a headline, was now lived again and again, through shelters saved, laws passed, voices found, and footsteps redirected away from danger. Maria was no longer just remembered, she was lived. In the outskirts of Milan, a modern art exhibit opened under the name What She Left Behind. The centerpiece was an enormous replica of an open suitcase, constructed of translucent steel and backlit so that every scratch and corner cast a web of delicate shadows across the walls. Inside it were dozens of suspended personal artifacts, each one contributed by a survivor. A photograph of a childhood home, a pair of broken heels, a burnt ID card, a crumpled bus ticket, and in the center, encased in bulletproof glass, was a scanned replica of Maria's last diary page. It read, "They don't see me yet, but I'm still here." That line had taken on a life of its own. It was quoted on international panels, whispered in vigils, sewn into banners, tattooed onto rib cages, printed onto university pamphlets. It became the final phrase of a spoken word poem performed at the United Nations during their Global Gender Equity Summit, where Maria's case was presented as one of 5 world-shifting femicides of the last decade. And during that performance, as her name was spoken, people from over 30 countries stood up in silent tribute, one by one, row by row, until the room was full of witnesses. Meanwhile, the Suitcase project had reached new heights. With support from global NGOs and UN Women, it expanded beyond Europe into South America and Southeast Asia. A mobile app version was launched, allowing people to anonymously submit cases of abuse or trafficking, linking them to legal resources, shelters, and emergency support. In its first year, the app helped over 8,000 women seek safe exit plans. Maria's virtual suitcase, still the first on the site, was now translated into 21 languages, and her reach went even further. In Latin America, an education initiative used her story as a training module in psychology programs, focusing on early trauma response and intervention. In Kenya, her case was part of a university's law curriculum focused on cross-border justice. In Tokyo, a silent theater troupe recreated her final days through shadows and silence alone. No words, just breath, gesture, and a single light flickering in the shape of a suitcase. People wept without ever hearing her name. Maria had transcended the very violence that tried to erase her. In one deeply personal moment, Maria's youngest sister, now 22 and a legal aid worker, spoke to a conference of law students in Prague. She stood on a bare stage, her voice trembling but firm, and said, "When my sister died, I wanted revenge. Now I want remembrance. Not just for her, for every woman who was told to be quiet, who was told her life wasn't worth protecting. I want you to say her name not in mourning, but in promise." The students gave her a standing ovation. She smiled through tears, and as she stepped off the stage, a professor placed a folded note in her hand. It read, "Because of Maria, my daughter left the man who was hurting her. She is safe now. She is free." Those quiet, unseen moments, those were her true legacy. Not the headlines, not the trial, not even the brutal details that first tore the public awake. Her legacy lived in the woman who walked out of a hotel room with her head held high, in the man who now looked at his partner and saw a person, not property, in the young girl who chose to report abuse instead of hiding it, in the parliament member who finally believed a woman's story the first time. And perhaps most sacred of all, Maria's legacy lived in the women who survived, who refused to disappear, who stayed. There was no justice that could resurrect her body. No sentence could unburn her face. No apology could undo the terror of that final night. But what had risen from her death had become larger than she could have imagined, and it had not ended. In a final piece of poetry submitted anonymously to an Italian survivor anthology titled After the Suitcase, the closing lines read,